I thought I had seen it all in my courtroom, until a last-minute confession completely changed everything and left me with the toughest decision of my career. I am Judge Vanessa Clark. I am 43 years old. I have been handing down sentences in New Orleans for over a decade, and what I'm about to tell you still keeps me awake at night. This case started out as something routine, just one of the hundreds that cross my desk every year. But what happened in that courtroom changed my understanding of justice forever. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. It was an ordinary Tuesday when I reviewed the file. A corporate fraud case. Marcus Bennett, a 38-year-old man, CFO of a mid-sized import company, was accused of embezzling more than $2 million. The evidence was solid. Bank transfers, signed documents, incriminating emails. Everything pointed directly at him. The prosecutor was confident. The defense seemed weak. I expected a trial lasting no more than 3 days. But from the very first moment, something didn't quite add up. Marcus didn't look like the typical white-collar criminal. He lacked that characteristic arrogance, that confidence of someone who thinks they can get away with it. On the contrary, he looked exhausted, defeated, but not guilty. There is a difference, believe me. After so many years, you can read it in their eyes. His wife Sarah was in the courtroom every day. 7 months pregnant, sitting in the front row, holding his hand whenever she could. They had 2 small children at home. The perfect image of a family destroyed by greed. Or so it seemed. The prosecutor presented his case methodically. Every document was another piece of the puzzle. Marcus had authorized transfers to phantom accounts. His signature was on everything. The numbers didn't lie. $2,200,000 disappeared over the course of 18 months. The defense argued that Marcus had been deceived, manipulated by someone else in the company, but they had no concrete proof. Just Marcus's word saying he trusted his partner, David Reeves, the CEO of the company, that David had told him those accounts were legitimate, part of a complex financial restructuring. David Reeves testified on the second day. Impeccable suit, precise answers, supporting documentation. He explained how Marcus had full access to the finances, how he, as CEO, trusted his CFO to handle those details. He seemed hurt by the betrayal, almost convincing. Almost. But something in his body language made me uneasy. Too rehearsed. Too perfect. I've seen nervous witnesses, honest witnesses, lying witnesses. David didn't quite fit into any category. The trial moved forward. Forensic accountants confirmed the irregularities. Marcus's lawyer did what he could, but the evidence was overwhelming. By the 4th day, I was mentally preparing my sentence. Proven fraud, mandatory restitution. Probably 7 to 10 years in federal prison. Sarah cried silently in her seat. Marcus looked at her with an expression I still remember perfectly. It wasn't fear for himself. It was terror for what his absence would do to them. And then the last day of the trial arrived. Closing arguments were scheduled for the morning. Afterwards, I would retire to deliberate and return with the verdict. Standard procedure. But before we began, Marcus's lawyer asked to approach the bench. He told me he had a last-minute witness, someone who had appeared that very morning with crucial information. The prosecutor immediately protested. Procedural irregularity, late evidence, all valid objections by the book. But something in the defense attorney's urgency made me pause. I granted him 10 minutes to present his motion. If he didn't convince me, we would proceed as planned. The witness entered the room. A young woman, maybe 25 years old, visibly nervous. She identified herself as Jennifer Lawson, David Reeves's administrative assistant for the past 3 years. And what she said next stunned the courtroom. Jennifer confessed that David had ordered her to forge documents, that the signatures of Marcus on several key documents were digital recreations she herself had made using specialized software, that David had told her it was part of an internal audit, something completely legal. But 2 weeks ago, Jennifer had seen the news about the trial. She recognized the documents and realized she had been used as a tool to incriminate an innocent man. The prosecutor jumped up like a spring. He demanded proof. Jennifer pulled a USB from her bag. It contained the original files, with intact metadata showing dates, modifications, everything. She also had recordings of conversations with David where he gave her specific instructions. The courtroom erupted. I called an immediate recess. I needed to verify that information before continuing. For the next 4 hours, digital forensic experts reviewed the USB's contents. The files were legitimate. The recordings, authentic. The evidence we had considered irrefutable throughout the trial was compromised. But here comes the part that broke me in two. Although the signatures were fake, the transfers had indeed happened. And Marcus had authorized some of them, trusting David's instructions without properly verifying. Technically, he had committed serious professional negligence. He wasn't completely innocent, but neither was he the criminal mastermind the prosecution painted him to be. And David? When federal agents came looking for him that afternoon, he had vanished. Bank account emptied, passport used that very morning, flight to a country without an extradition treaty. I faced the most complex dilemma of my career. Legally, Marcus had been negligent. He had signed documents without due diligence. He had blindly trusted someone who was using him. That had legal consequences, even if he wasn't the villain of the story. But morally, I knew this man had been the victim of an elaborate manipulation, that his family was about to be destroyed, that the real millions were in David Reeves's hands, sunbathing on some beach while Marcus faced prison. I deliberated for 3 days. I reviewed every legal precedent I could find. I consulted informally with colleagues. I didn't sleep well any of those nights. Sarah wrote me a letter. She shouldn't have. Technically, it's not appropriate to contact the judge directly, but it arrived at my office anyway. It didn't speak of mercy or justice. It simply described her children asking when Daddy would come home. It said the baby she was expecting would probably get to know her father through prison visits. I shouldn't have read it, but I did. Finally, the day of sentencing arrived. The courtroom was full. Press, family, onlookers. Marcus was pale but standing firm. Sarah held her belly with both hands. I read my decision slowly, choosing each word carefully. I found Marcus guilty of professional negligence and financial misconduct. Not intentional fraud, but failing in his fiduciary duties as CFO. The difference was crucial. Instead of 7 to 10 years in federal prison, I sentenced him to 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and partial restitution proportional to his actual responsibility in the case. I also permanently revoked his professional finance certifications. In addition, I issued an international arrest warrant for David Reeves and ordered all corporate assets frozen until the embezzled funds were recovered. It wasn't perfect. It didn't fully satisfy either party. The prosecutor seemed frustrated. The defense, relieved but aware it wasn't a full acquittal. But it was fair, or the fairest I could achieve with the information I had. Marcus cried when he heard the sentence. Sarah collapsed in her seat, sobbing with relief. Their children would have their father at home. The baby would get to know her dad. That night, alone in my office, I allowed myself to cry too, not out of sadness, but exhaustion. I had done what I believed right in my conscience, but I knew there would be criticism. Some would say I was too lenient. Others would say I should have acquitted him completely. Justice is not always black or white. Sometimes it's a million shades of gray, and you have to choose the shade closest to the truth that you can reach. The scales of justice are not a machine. They are held by human hands that tremble, doubt, and do their best. And that effort, imperfect as it may be, is all we have. Marcus completed his probation exemplary. He now works as a business ethics consultant, teaching other professionals not to make his mistakes. Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They sent me a photo, although they probably shouldn't have. David Reeves was captured 2 years later in Brazil. He faced full federal charges. He is serving 15 years without parole. This case taught me that truth can appear when you least expect it, that a last-minute confession can change absolutely everything you thought you knew, and that being a judge isn't just about mechanically applying the law, but understanding the human context behind every case. The case arrived in my courtroom on a rainy March Tuesday. I remember perfectly how the drops struck the courthouse windows, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm that contrasted with the tension in the room. It was a vehicular homicide case that, according to all the documents I had reviewed over weeks, seemed absolutely clear. Marcus Thompson, a 32-year-old man with no criminal record, had fatally hit Sarah Chen, a 26-year-old medical student, one November night. The charges were serious: aggravated vehicular homicide and driving under the influence of alcohol. During the 3 weeks the trial lasted, the prosecution presented an almost flawless case. The evidence was overwhelming. The blood test showed Marcus had a blood alcohol level of 0.09, above the legal limit. Witnesses testified they saw him stumbling out of a bar. Security cameras showed his vehicle speeding through the intersection just as Sarah was trying to cross the street. The coroner's report confirmed that the young woman died instantly from the impact. Everything fit together terribly and perfectly. Marcus's defense was weak at best. His attorney, an overworked public defender named James Rivera, tried to argue that the road conditions were hazardous that night, that there was fog, that the lighting was poor, but none of that changed the fundamental fact: Marcus had driven drunk, and a young woman with a bright future had lost her life. Sarah's parents attended the trial every day, sitting in the front row, their faces marked by a pain no sentence could ease. Marcus remained silent for most of the process. I watched him carefully, as I do with all defendants. He showed no arrogance I have seen in some guilty parties, but neither the innocent desperation of others. He seemed simply shattered, sunk into a deep guilt that visibly consumed him. He had noticeably lost weight since his arrest, his lawyer told me. He barely spoke, barely ate, barely existed. The last day of the trial arrived with the same persistent rain that had marked the whole process. The prosecution presented their final arguments with a controlled passion I professionally admired, though I remained impartial. They painted the picture of an irresponsible man who made selfish decisions and took a precious life. They showed photographs of Sarah, graduating from college, volunteering at free clinics, smiling alongside her parents. It was impossible not to feel the devastation of that loss. When it was the defense's turn, James Rivera stood with an exhausted expression. I expected the usual arguments about mitigating circumstances, about a momentary mistake that shouldn't define a whole life. But instead, he did something that took me completely by surprise. He turned to Marcus and said gently, "This is your last chance to speak." The silence in the room was absolute. Marcus remained motionless for what seemed like an eternity. Then, slowly, he stood up. His hands trembled. His lawyer brought him the microphone, and we all waited. I expected maybe an apology, perhaps a cry, possibly an emotional plea for mercy. What came out of his mouth changed absolutely everything. "Sarah Chen didn't die because of me," he said with a broken but firm voice. The murmur in the room was immediate. I struck the gavel, demanding order. Sarah's parents stood up, outraged, but something in Marcus's expression made me raise my hand, asking for silence. "Let him continue," I ordered, though my own mind was racing. Marcus swallowed and continued. "I had been drinking that night. Yes, I crossed that intersection. But I didn't hit her." The prosecutor stood to object, but I stopped him with a gesture. I needed to hear this. "There was another car," Marcus continued, and now tears ran freely down his face. "A black car, I think a sedan, coming the opposite way at high speed. I saw Sarah in the crosswalk and braked. I braked hard. There are skid marks," the investigators said, "but the other car hit her first, from the other side, and threw her toward my vehicle. I felt her hit my car, but she was already dead when she hit me." The courtroom erupted into chaos. I pounded the gavel repeatedly, ordering silence. The prosecutor stood, clearly as stunned as I was. "Why didn't you say this earlier?" I shouted over the noise. "Why wait until now?" Marcus collapsed into his chair, covering his face with his hands. "Because the other driver was my brother," he whispered, but the microphone caught every word. "My younger brother, Daniel. He's 17. He had taken my other car without permission that night. When he passed and saw what had happened, he panicked and ran. He got home before the police arrested me. He begged me, pleaded with me. He said his life would be over, that he'd go to jail as a minor. I thought I could protect him, that I could carry this for him. But I can't anymore. I can't live with this lie. Sarah deserves the truth. Her parents deserve the truth." The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at the faces in the room, the prosecutor frozen in place, the defense attorney visibly shocked, Sarah's parents hugging and crying, some spectators with their mouths open. I felt as if the floor were moving beneath my feet. I immediately ordered an emergency recess and summoned both attorneys to my chambers. In my office, With the blinds closed and the rain still beating against the windows, I faced a situation for which my 20 years of career had not fully prepared me. The prosecutor, Daniel Moreno, a meticulous man who rarely lost his composure, paced back and forth like a caged animal. James Rivera, the public defender, had collapsed into a chair with an expression of utter bewilderment. I stood behind my desk, hands resting on the wooden surface, trying to process what I had just heard. "This is a last-minute desperate strategy," Moreno finally said, although his voice lacked the usual conviction. "A convenient confession when everything is already lost. Your Honor, this is clearly an attempt to manipulate the court, to create reasonable doubt where none exists." I raised my hand, asking for calm. "Mr. Moreno, I understand your position, but we have just heard a sworn statement that introduces completely new elements to the case. I cannot simply ignore it." I turned to Rivera. "You didn't know anything about this either, did you?" The defender shook his head, still visibly shocked. "Absolutely nothing, Your Honor. Marcus never mentioned any other vehicle, never spoke of his brother. I worked with the evidence I had, tried to build the best defense possible under the circumstances, but this changes the entire picture of the case." I slowly sat down in my chair, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders like never before. I need to verify if there is a younger brother. I need to know if this Daniel Thompson exists. Mr. Rivera, your client has just made a confession that implicates him in obstruction of justice and possibly as an accomplice. Do you understand the ramifications of what just happened? "I understand perfectly, Your Honor," Rivera replied, regaining some of his professionalism. "But I also understand that if what Marcus says is true, we have been judging the wrong man for the wrong crime. He is still guilty of drunk driving, no doubt, but Sarah Chen's death may not be his responsibility, at least not directly." Moreno intervened with renewed vehemence. "And we're just going to believe his word? After he has lied for months? After allowing an entire trial to unfold based on a false narrative? Your Honor, this reeks of manipulation from any angle. He was right in part, but something in Marcus's genuine desperation, in the absolute pain I saw in his eyes, made me doubt. I've seen many liars in my courtroom. I've heard countless fabricated stories, elaborate excuses, carefully constructed narratives to evade responsibility. This didn't feel like that. This felt like a man breaking under the weight of an unbearable truth. "Here's what we're going to do," I said finally, with the firm voice I had cultivated over the years to hide any inner uncertainty. "I'm ordering a 48-hour recess. During that time, Mr. Moreno, I want your office to investigate everything Marcus has just declared. Confirm the existence of the younger brother, review any vehicle records associated with the Thompson family, re-examine the security cameras in the area specifically, looking for a second vehicle, and I want to speak with this Daniel Thompson immediately if he exists." "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," Moreno protested. "The trial is practically over. Only closing arguments and jury deliberation remain. Restarting the investigation at this point, highly irregular is exactly what just happened in my courtroom," I interrupted firmly. "And I will not sentence a man for a crime he possibly did not commit just because it's convenient to end the process. Justice is not about convenience, Mr. Moreno, it's about truth. If Marcus Thompson is telling the truth, then we were about to commit a catastrophic judicial error. If he is lying, then that lie will be exposed under rigorous investigation, and he will face the appropriate consequences. But I need to know which situation we are facing." Moreno nodded reluctantly. Rivera seemed relieved but also deeply concerned, probably considering the multiple layers of legal problems his client now faced. I dismissed them both and was left alone in my office as the rain continued its relentless tapping against the windows. I walked to the window and looked down at the wet street below, where people hurried under umbrellas, unaware of the drama unfolding on the 15th floor of the courthouse. I thought of Sarah Chen, her bright smile in those photographs, her stolen future. I thought of her parents, sitting day after day in that courtroom, waiting for justice, waiting for someone to pay for the irreparable loss they had suffered. I thought of Marcus Thompson, consumed by the weight of a guilt perhaps more complex than we had all assumed. And I thought of a 17-year-old boy who had potentially fled the scene, leaving his older brother to bear the consequences of his action. The next 48 hours were the longest of my career. I kept my phone close constantly, awaiting updates on the investigation. The first call came just 6 hours after the recess. Moreno confirmed that there was indeed a Daniel Thompson, 17 years old, Marcus's younger brother. He had a provisional driver's license. The family owned 2 vehicles, the one Marcus was driving that night and a black sedan registered to their father. The second call arrived the next morning. They had located Daniel Thompson and brought him in for questioning with his parents and a lawyer present. He initially denied everything, but confronted with his brother's confession, he completely broke down. He admitted taking his father's car without permission, drinking with friends, driving home too fast. He admitted seeing the young woman at the crossing too late, feeling the horrible impact, panicking, and fleeing. He described how he arrived home minutes before the police arrested Marcus at the scene, how his brother found him trembling and confessed what he had done, how Marcus made the decision at that moment to protect him. The third call was the one that definitively changed the case. Investigators had reviewed the security cameras with new search parameters. They found grainy but identifiable images of a second vehicle, a dark sedan, approaching the intersection from the opposite direction simultaneously with Marcus's car. The quality was not perfect due to the fog that was indeed present that night, but the timing matched exactly what Marcus had described. The revised forensic analysis of Sarah's injuries also suggested an initial impact from a different angle than what Marcus's vehicle would have caused. Marcus Thompson had been telling the truth. When I summoned all parties to my office again, the atmosphere was completely different. Moreno entered with a somber expression, carrying a thick folder with the results of the investigation. Rivera arrived accompanied by Marcus, who looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept in days, which was probably true. And for the first time, there were new faces. Marcus Thompson's parents and Daniel, the younger, brother who had remained invisible throughout the entire process. Daniel Thompson was thin, with barely the beginning of a beard on his face, and looked absolutely terrified. His red eyes and deep dark circles showed he hadn't rested either. When our eyes met briefly, I saw in him something I immediately recognized. The face of someone whose life had irrevocably changed in a single moment, someone who would have to carry the weight of his actions for the rest of his existence. I sat down and looked carefully at each person in the room before speaking. Mr. Moreno, I understand you have new findings to share with everyone present. The prosecutor nodded, his professional posture intact, but with something of his usual arrogance definitely absent. Your Honor, the supplementary investigation has substantially confirmed the version of events presented by Marcus Thompson. There is video evidence of a second vehicle at the intersection at the critical moment. The revised forensic analysis suggests the fatal impact came from that second vehicle, not the one driven by the accused. And Daniel Thompson has formally confessed to being the driver responsible for the hit and run that caused Sarah Chen's death. There was a heavy silence in the room. Marcus's mother began to cry silently, her husband placing a protective arm around her. Daniel kept his head bowed, unable to look at anyone. Marcus remained motionless, with an expression that mixed relief, pain, and something I couldn't fully describe. I understand, I said carefully. This presents an extraordinarily complex legal situation. We have a confirmed crime, but the perpetrator has turned out to be different from the one originally accused. However, Marcus Thompson is not innocent. He drove under the influence of alcohol that night. He obstructed justice by lying to the authorities. He allowed an entire investigation to develop under false premises. He covered up for a criminal, even if that criminal was his younger brother. I turned directly to Marcus. Mr. Thompson, your decision to protect your brother is understandable from a human, even emotional point of view. But from a legal standpoint, you committed serious crimes. Do you understand that? Marcus nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor, I understand. I don't expect mercy. I just needed the truth to come out before it was too late. I couldn't let them sentence me for the death of that young woman when I know who really caused it. I accept the consequences of my actions, all my actions that night, but I couldn't accept carrying the burden for a death I did not cause. His honesty struck me. For months he had kept a silence that must have been absolutely torturous, watching the case build against him, knowing the truth but protecting it, until finally the weight became unbearable. I wondered how many sleepless nights he had endured, how many times he had been on the verge of confessing before finally doing so. Daniel Thompson, I said, directing my attention to the teenager. Look at me, please. Slowly, with visible effort, the young man lifted his gaze. His eyes were full of unshed tears. You're 17 years old. You made terrible mistakes that night. Drinking, driving intoxicated, reckless driving, and worst of all, fleeing the scene of a fatal accident. But your older brother, in a deeply wrong act, though motivated by love, decided to protect you from the consequences. Do you understand what he sacrificed for you? Do you understand he was willing to go to prison, to ruin his own life, to protect you? Yes, Your Honor, Daniel replied in a broken voice. I never asked him to. When I told him what had happened, he just made the decision. I tried to stop him. I tried to tell him he should confess. But he told me I was too young, that I had my whole life ahead of me, that he could handle it. But I haven't been able to live with this. I haven't been able to eat or sleep or think of anything but that girl and what I did to her and what I was doing to my brother. It was evident he was telling the truth. Remorse emanated from him in almost palpable waves. But remorse did not bring Sarah Chen back to life. Remorse did not ease the pain of her parents. Remorse was important, it was necessary, but it was not enough. Moreno spoke again. Your Honor, my office is preparing formal charges against Daniel Thompson for vehicular homicide, underage driving under the influence, and leaving the scene of an accident. Given his age, he will be tried in the juvenile system, but we will seek the harshest sentence possible within that framework. Regarding Marcus Thompson, we maintain charges of driving under the influence, obstruction of justice, and covering up a crime. We are dropping the charges directly related to Sarah Chen's death, but this does not mean we consider his actions acceptable in any way. Rivera intervened. Your Honor, my client finally did the right thing. Yes, he took too long, and that's true. But he faced an impossible choice in a moment of crisis, and when he realized he couldn't keep living with that lie, he had the courage to tell the truth, fully knowing he would face severe legal consequences. That must count for something. He was right, but so was Moreno. This was exactly the kind of situation that made justice so complex, so difficult to administer. There were no simple answers, no solutions that left everyone satisfied. There was only the truth, finally revealed, and the responsibility to decide what to do with it. I need to speak with Sarah Chen's parents, I said finally. They deserve to know what has happened before we make any final decision on how to proceed. This case affects them more than anyone, and their voice must be heard. The meeting with Sarah Chen's parents was, without exaggeration, one of the most difficult experiences of my judicial career. I summoned them to my office 2 days later, giving them time to process the initial information that Moreno had communicated to them about the new developments in the case. When they entered, accompanied by the victim's prosecutor, I could see that the news had reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal, missus. Chen was a small woman with dark hair and gray strands that she hadn't had before the accident, as I was told later. Her husband, taller and strongly built, seemed to have physically shrunk under the weight of grief. Both looked exhausted in a way that transcended the physical. It was the exhaustion of the soul that comes with the loss of a child. I explained the situation as carefully as I could, detailing how Marcus's confession had led to additional investigation, how Daniel was identified as the driver who actually hit their daughter, and how this fundamentally changed the case they had followed for months. They listened in silence, holding hands, with silent tears streaming down both of their faces. When I finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Mr. Chen spoke, his voice hoarse with restrained emotion. All these months, we've been waiting for justice for Sarah. Waiting for the man who took her life to face the consequences. And now you're telling us that man is a child. A teenager who made a terrible mistake. Not only that, added Mrs. Chen, her voice trembling, but his older brother was willing to sacrifice his own life to protect him. I don't know if that makes everything more tragic, or less. Sarah will never come back, no matter who was behind the wheel that night. She was right, of course. The identity of the driver did not change the most devastating outcome. Their daughter was dead, and no sentence, no punishment, no amount of justice could change that. But still, justice mattered. It had to matter. What do you want? I asked gently. Legally, my decision must be based on the law, but your perspective, your feelings, are important. You have the right to be heard in this process. They looked at each other, communicating in that silent language couples develop after decades together. Finally, Mrs. Chen answered, "We want both brothers to face consequences for what they did. Daniel for causing our daughter's death, Marcus for lying and obstructing justice. But also," she paused, visibly struggling with her emotions, "we also understand that completely destroying 2 more lives won't bring Sarah back. She was compassionate, always saw the best in people. I don't know what she would have wanted, but I know it wasn't vengeance," Mr. Chen added. "We want them to face real consequences, to understand the weight of what they did. But we don't need to see them destroyed to feel that justice was done for Sarah. We need to know they learned, that they truly repented, that this tragedy will mean something more than just more ruined lives. Their grace in the midst of such profound pain moved me to tears. I had seen victim families consumed by a thirst for revenge, and while that was completely understandable, this different path that the Chens were choosing required extraordinary strength. Over the following weeks, I worked tirelessly to determine the appropriate sentence for both Thompson brothers. Daniel, being a minor, would be processed in the juvenile system, but that didn't mean he would escape significant consequences. Marcus faced serious charges that could result in years of imprisonment. I reviewed precedents, consulted with other judges, spoke with experts on rehabilitation and recidivism, and spent sleepless nights weighing every relevant factor. On sentencing day, the courtroom was filled to the last seat. The media had followed every twist of the case, and the last-minute confession had generated renewed and intense public interest. The Chens were present, sitting in the front row with silent dignity. The Thompson brothers' parents were across the aisle, looking devastated to have both their sons facing criminal charges. When I entered and everyone stood, I felt the weight of all those eyes, all those expectations, all those hopes that somehow I would find a just resolution in a fundamentally unjust situation. I sat, waited for everyone to do the same, and took a deep breath before beginning. "This case," I began, "has been extraordinary in many ways. It has challenged assumptions, revealed painful truths, and forced everyone involved to confront deeply difficult questions about justice, family, responsibility, and redemption. I have carefully considered all relevant factors: the severity of the crimes committed, the unique circumstances surrounding those crimes, the genuine remorse shown, the devastating impact on the Chen family, and the potential for rehabilitation." I looked directly at Daniel Thompson, who stood beside his lawyer, visibly trembling. "Daniel Thompson, you were responsible for the death of Sarah Chen, a 22-year-old woman with her whole life ahead of her. Your decisions that night to drink underage, to drive intoxicated, to flee the scene demonstrated catastrophic poor judgment. For that, I sentence you to 3 years in a juvenile detention center, followed by 5 years of strictly supervised probation. During that time, you will complete community service, speaking at schools about the dangers of drunk driving. You will also write a letter of apology to the Chen family, not because it erases what you did, but because you need to fully face the impact of your actions." Then I turned to Marcus, whose expression was one of resigned acceptance. "Marcus Thompson, your crimes were different but equally serious. You lied to authorities, obstructed a criminal investigation, and allowed an entire case to be built on false premises. At the same time, you finally found the courage to tell the truth when it might have been easier to keep silent. I sentence you to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. I hope you use that time to deeply reflect on the decisions you made and the man you want to be when you come out." There was a murmur in the room when I finished delivering the sentences. Some thought I had been too harsh, others too lenient. But that is the nature of real justice. It rarely fully satisfies everyone because it is trying to balance needs and values that are often in direct conflict. I observed the reactions in the room. Daniel had collapsed in his chair, openly crying, his mother running towards him despite the sheriff's protests. Marcus remained standing, stiff, eyes closed, and hands clenched at his sides. The Chens were hugging silently, and I couldn't tell if my decision had brought them some kind of peace or just more pain. Before adjourning the session, I added something else, something not in my prepared notes but that I felt needed to be said. I want everyone in this room to understand something, Justice is not vengeance. It is not simply punishment for punishment's sake. True justice must acknowledge the harm caused, must hold accountable those who caused it, but it must also, whenever possible, open a path toward healing and redemption. Sarah Chen deserves to be remembered as more than a victim. She deserves to be remembered as the person she was, a young woman with dreams and talent and a whole life she will never get to live. And the best way to honor her memory is not simply to destroy more lives, but to ensure that Daniel and Marcus Thompson understand the value of the life that was lost and live the rest of their days in a way that proves they have learned that lesson. The days following the sentencing were exhausting. The media wanted interviews, which I declined. There were opinion pieces criticizing my decision from both ends of the spectrum, and I received dozens of letters both supporting and condemning me. But what weighed on me most was not public opinion, but the persistent question of whether I had truly done the right thing. Nights, I stayed awake, going over every detail of the case, questioning every aspect of my reasoning. 3 months after the trial, I received a letter. It was from Mrs. Chen, handwritten on simple stationery. I opened it with trembling hands, not knowing what to expect. Her letter began with an account of how they had been processing everything, of the grief therapy sessions they attended, of the good days and the bad days they still experienced. But then she wrote something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. Judge Clark, the letter said. At first we were confused and hurt by how everything unfolded. We felt the truth that finally came to light somehow invalidated our pain from the previous months. But over time, we have come to understand something. Marcus Thompson, by finally telling the truth, gave us something we didn't know we needed. He gave us the whole story. We can be at peace knowing exactly what happened that night. And his confession, despite the personal cost to him, showed that even in the worst circumstances, human conscience can prevail. That doesn't bring back our Sarah, but it gives us a small measure of faith that people can choose to do what is right, even when it's terribly hard. Thank you for listening to us and for considering not only legal justice, but also the kind of justice we believe Sarah would have wanted. I had to step away from my desk and walk to the window, letting the tears flow freely. In all my years on the bench, I had received many letters from families of victims, some grateful, others furious. But this one, with its impossible grace and wisdom earned through such pain, touched something deep within me. The Chens had found a way to transform their tragedy not into vengeance, but into something approaching understanding. It was not forgiveness. Exactly, they were not obligated to forgive, but it was an acknowledgement of the moral complexity of the situation. A year later, I requested a follow-up on both Thompson brothers. Daniel was at the juvenile center, where he reportedly had been a model inmate. He had started an educational program, was working with a therapist on his emerging alcoholism, and had written multiple drafts of his letter to the Chens, none of which he felt adequately captured his remorse. His counselor reported that he spoke constantly of Sarah, of how he imagined who she might have been, of how he carried her memory with him every day. Marcus had served 12 months of his sentence when I saw him. He had requested a hearing, which was his right. When he entered the courtroom, he looked different from the young man who had confessed nearly 2 years before. There was a stillness in him, a seriousness that had not been there before. He informed me that he had used his time in prison to obtain vocational certifications, and that he had been writing, processing, everything that had happened. He asked permission to share something he had written, and I granted it. I have had a lot of time to think about the decisions I made. He read from his papers, his voice controlled but emotional. For a long time, I told myself I was protecting my younger brother. That made my lies somehow noble. But the truth is, I was also protecting myself from having to face that I had failed as an older brother in the worst possible way. I wasn't there when Daniel needed me that night. I hadn't taught him better. I hadn't been the example I should have been. And then, when I tried to fix that failure by lying and taking the blame, I only made everything worse. I failed Daniel again. I failed Sarah Chen, I failed her family, and I failed myself. There is no way to undo that. But I can spend the rest of my life trying to be the person I should have been from the start. I left the courthouse that afternoon with a feeling I rarely experienced after a case, not exactly peace, because there could never be true peace in a situation born of such tragedy, but a confirmation that perhaps, just perhaps, I had made the right decision. Justice is not always clear. It is not always satisfying. and it certainly does not always repair the harm done. But at its best, justice creates space for truth to emerge, for accountability to be accepted, and for people to find paths forward, no matter how painful. This case taught me that Marcus's last-minute confession was not just about revealing who had been behind the wheel. It was about a young man finding the courage to choose truth over convenience, integrity over self-preservation. And that choice, belated though it was, changed everything, not just the legal outcome, but the entire moral nature of the case. It reminded me why I chose this job not to dole out punishment, but to seek truth and find resolutions that honor both the gravity of the harm and the possibility of human redemption.